Hi, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of the ALD Stories podcast. During this conversation, my guests and I really celebrate ALD, not only as a technology, but as a forum for expression and glue for a community. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Matthias Young to the show today, a friend and fellow George Group alumni. Matthias is an assistant professor at the University of Missouri in the departments of chemical engineering and chemistry. An NSF fellow, Matthias received his PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder under Professor Stephen George, followed by consecutive postdocs at NIST and Argonne National Lab. However, these postdoc positions saw Matthias leave the field of ALD for some time before making his way back after a period of scientific and communal reflection. At Mizzou, Matthias' lab focuses on two main projects: oxidative molecular layer deposition of Redox-Active Polymers for energy applications, and pair distribution analysis of the local atomic structure of films grown by ALD. The former, which we will take a deeper dive into this episode, is an homage to work Matthias completed during his PhD, where he now hopes to create organic electrode materials which are comparable to current inorganic staples, but more cost-effective and sustainable in use. In this episode, Matthias and I discuss his journey to, from, and back to ALD, how working in other fields can benefit your creativity, results from his recent work in depositing redox-active polymer films, and how ALD can be used as a tool for understanding fundamental questions about tricky surface phenomenon. I must give a huge thanks to Matthias for being so willing and vulnerable to discuss his experience in ALD and for teaching me more about his great work happening at Mizzou. I really believe those who work in ALD understand the immense value offered by its constituents, and this conversation is a reminder of how exciting and energizing it is to be part of our tribe. So with that, please grab your tea or coffee and enjoy episode 17 of the ALD Stories podcast.
Welcome to ALD Stories, a series of conversations where we share the untold stories of atomic layer deposition and the people behind the technology. This podcast is brought to you by Venec, the home of ALD.
Matthias, we're here in the studio now, so we can get started, I suppose, on podcast episode number, I think you are going to be number 17. But yeah, I've been asking everybody this, but I maybe asked you before, have you done a podcast or like interview like this before?
This is my first time.
Hey, cool. That's exciting. I think you're the first graduate from Steve's group that I'm doing this with now. And welcome to the podcast, Matthias. And thanks again for taking some time away from your day, from your morning in Missouri, from the other side of the world to talk with me. And just to get started, I want to talk first about something you brought up in your last correspondence to me about your journey kind of back to ALD and your relationship with ALD, because I think it's a really good story and a really good segue into then the work that you're actually doing now in ALD. So you kind of mentioned to me in your last email that you felt when you finished grad school that all the good ideas in ALD were gone. So could you tell me a little bit about your experience in graduate school and how it led you to have that kind of feeling, and then how that pulled you away from ALD at that time?
Yeah, again, so when I started in graduate school, I didn't come to graduate school knowing I wanted to work on ALD. I wanted to work on energy storage. My vision was I wanted to be an entrepreneur and figure out some fundamental aspect about why batteries didn't work as well as we wanted them to, and then use that fundamental understanding to make batteries better, and then hopefully start a company off it. That's what I had in my head when I started. That was perhaps a naive perspective. I've now, after going to graduate school and working in the field of electrochemistry and thin film ALD for 15 years, I now recognize that community, thousands of people are working in that area and have been for many years. And the chances of me making that discovery when I started grad school were minimal. But when you start as a first-year PhD student, you don't quite have that perspective to know. And then I've talked to various different groups at University of Colorado to try to figure out who could help me on that journey. And in the process of doing that, I got connected up with Steve George because of this idea I had about trying to use surface reactions on high surface area carbons to introduce reactive sites that could react to store energy in batteries. So if you could just nucleate very small particles or thin films on defect sites in carbon, you could then put that reactive material down that would lead to really rapid energy storage. that led me into ALD, which started me on this path of using ALD for energy storage for electrochemical applications. And then I really fell in love with ALD being in Steve's group. There are various things that appealed to me, but I think most of all was the ability to control matter atom by atom, right? The allure of atomic scale control, the same phrase that's at the beginning of many ALD papers. That was really attractive to me. But then I worked in the group for 5 years, published a number of papers. I really tried to use this idea of nucleating metal oxides on carbon for energy storage, try to push that as far as I could. And I wasn't the only one that had that idea, right? There were 3 or 4 other groups at the time publishing in that same vein. We were all trying to push it forward, and it worked. It really did work, but it was cost prohibitive. The organometallic precursors we were using to impart redox activity were just too expensive. We actually, when I was a grad student, we filed a patent. We talked to ALD Nanosolutions. At that time, that was before they merged with Forge Nano, and we tried to commercialize it. We looked at the cost curves to see if we could scale it up, and it was just too expensive. And so I was a little bit disheartened with ALD at the time. I wanted to work in energy storage and try to do something to make a difference there. And I just felt that ALD was never going to get there. So the postdoc I did immediately afterwards was in nanomaterials. So it was layered hydroxide synthesis, which is a whole different arena from what I had been doing. It was nanoparticle formulation, so a wet chemical method. And it was a lot higher volume, right? You could use lower cost precursors, synthesize a lot more material quickly. But what I found in the 2-year postdoc when I was working in that area was that the synthesis was not nearly as controlled. And really, I just felt like a lot of papers I was reading and the work I was doing myself, I didn't have confidence in because I didn't feel the reproducibility was there. And I think I had this opportunity, I think, at that point. I could have stuck with nanoparticle synthesis and tried to bring the level of control and automation that ALD has to the nanoparticle community. But just the parameter space was so vast, all these different precursors and all these different minute variables and how they could be impacting things, that the allure of ALD pulled me back in, this ability to control matter at the nanoscale. And I started to think more precisely about it and what really was the problem for why I couldn't accomplish that goal I set out for, of using ALD to enable high energy density batteries. And that kind of brought me to where I am now. What my group is working on now is, instead of using organometallic precursors, we're trying to focus on polymers. So using monomers, a lot lower cost precursors, that once you grow a polymer, it has the same functional properties that an inorganic material would have, but you're using earth abundant elements, right? Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, to then create the functional properties that we wanted. So the electrochemical energy storage.
You don't know how good you have it until you let it go.
Yeah.
And if it comes back to you, then that's true love. And it seems that it did make its way back to you, which is really fantastic.
Another thing that pulled me back was the ALD community. I kind of got connected up to various other communities. I did some computational work in my PhD and afterwards. So density functional theory and modeling. And I got a little bit plugged into the nanoparticle community and some other communities. I started to put feelers out and get to know more of the landscape. And after having worked in the ALD community and then being exposed to other communities, I really wanted to get back to the ALD community, in part because the people are so supportive. Just the mentality is about helping each other, and the way that publishing happens and the way that I didn't see, and I still don't see, a lot of contentious behavior. There's not people putting down other people's work. It's all very supportive. People want to see each other succeed. It's considered like a win for ALD if anybody does good work and gets acclaim or technological success. And that's just awesome. That community is really important, and I was really happy to come back to it.
Yeah, I think that by and large, it is one of the most collaborative and tight-knit communities I've seen. And maybe that's a product of the technology being a lot young and the community being young and maybe a little bit small still, but ever growing. I think I've even seen this for the PicoSun acquisition by Applied Materials. The initial reaction from a lot of people, especially for people who worked at Benick, people were asking, "Oh, like, how do you feel about this? Is it scary? What is it?" And I mean, at the end of the day, it's just a good thing for the ALD community, and I think, yeah, very validating for everybody in it that this is going in the right direction and being recognized on a pretty global scale for something like that. So, and I think a lot of people have felt that way. And in any other, I should maybe not generalize, but in a lot of other places that may not have been the reaction.
Yeah, and I agree. It's a smaller community. The number of names that you see out there is smaller than some communities, right? There are these vast communities where there's lots and lots of people, and it's hard to even know who the real players are. That ALD is smaller, but it's ever growing, and you continue to see more people come to the ALD conferences. More papers get published. I think it's hundreds of papers a year that use TMA water ALD in their publications. As new people come in, it's always the community is very welcoming to those new people, right? They want want to expand the reach of ALD, and if somebody's interested in doing it, they are welcomed into the fold. If you can call up anybody and say, "Hey, I'm trying to do this. Can you give me some advice?" And they're happy to talk to you about it. I think it's like this. We all know how hard it is to get a good ALD reactor, a functioning ALD reactor. Get past all of the small problems that can cause small things that can cause big problems and prevent your ALD reactor from working. And everybody knows that struggle, and they want to help each other.
Did you have this impression when you were a graduate student too, or did it take kind of going out into postdoc world and then your eventual moving into a professorship that you kind of felt this closeness?
I guess I started to feel it at the first ALD conference that I went to in graduate school, so I was aware of it. But honestly, it was the first experience I had at a big conference, was at an ALD conference. So I kind of thought, oh, this is how it always is. As I advanced in my PhD, I saw other conferences, other sorts of behavior. I've been at a conference where people stood up and like berated the person presenting, which you never see at an ALD conference. I've never seen that happen. And so I did start to see it in graduate school, but I didn't fully appreciate it until I moved into my postdocs and beyond. It was as I was going into my postdocs that I recognized, this is something precious, right? This is a really valuable thing to have such a good community, and I didn't want to just lose that, throw it away.
Yeah, I can totally relate. I almost left grad school about halfway through. Just, I mean, there's a reason I'm doing marketing now, and I'm not still in the lab. But as you can see, I'm still in ALD, and it was by and large people that pulled me back and kept me and really encouraged me to finish the PhD out and everything. I'm very grateful for those people. Yeah, we're really lucky to have the community that we do. But this is really, really interesting, Matthias, because you mentioned that you wanted to start a company in energy storage like right off the bat when you went to grad school. Maybe it was a naive idea, maybe not. And then you made it back to this crossroads. Now it's your postdoc of, I can either figure out how to make really stable nanoparticle synthesis, or I can make my way back to this idea that I had during grad school. And so when you made that decision, okay, I'm going to go back to ALD, was it an obvious decision that, okay, I'm going to go to university and become a professor and make it happen in lab? Or did you still have this idea of, I'm going to start a company based off this now?
So at that time, in my first postdoc, so I was an NRC postdoc fellow at NIST in Colorado. So it's just down the road from University of Colorado, where I did my PhD work. And I was working on nanoparticle synthesis there. And during that postdoc, I kind of decided I wanted to go into a faculty position. And this dream of still starting a company, from my perspective, like if I start the company, somebody else starts the company, I don't really care. It's not the money that I want. There's just this idea of taking an idea, starting with a fundamental concept, surrounding a deeper understanding of the world, a deeper understanding of science, starting there, and then taking it all the way to completion, where you then apply that knowledge to create a new technology. It's my dream to be a part of that, to see that to the end. And if somebody else is making all the money off of it, I'm okay with that. If I know that the advances that we made helped enable it, and so that's kind of the vision that I have. I realized that in my experience in graduate school, it's rare for you to find the magic bullet that's going to make a technology work right off the bat. It takes many years. It takes a long time to see an idea come all the way to fruition. And I really saw the allure of if you have an academic position, that's what you do, is you generate new ideas and work on new ideas all the time, and you continue to advance knowledge to enable these fundamental concepts, and you have the freedom to start a company, right? You can start an LLC or start a startup as a professor, maybe hire somebody to run the company, but you can have the IP and continue to generate the technological property or the technological value that helps that company succeed, while being under the umbrella of the university. And so that if I were to try to start a company outside of a university environment, I would need to get angel investors or some other kind of investors to put money into the business, or invest my personal funds to then hire a lawyer to file the patents to then start a company. But at a university, I mean, I don't own the IP, the university owns the IP, but they're also willing to, provided I can convince them it's a good idea, they are willing to pay for the legal fees to file the patents and start to build that technology portfolio that could get a company off the ground. So, I mean, what I really enjoy is the innovating the ideas and the fundamental science of it, and that's what a professor does. So I think that's really what put me in the position I'm in now. There's another aspect of it too. I mean, universities are really about mentoring and teaching, and that enabling the next generation of students to use the technology that we're working on. Not just that, but to help contribute to developing the understanding and the technology. I think is awesome. It's really fun to be in a lab where you're surrounded by young, enthusiastic minds, lots of energy.
So potentially there's a student in your group that could be, stewing on the idea of starting that company when they finish at Mizzou.
Yeah, I hope so. There's, the more time goes, the more ideas you have. And this initial idea of energy storage using ALD reactions on high surface area carbons, it's still valuable and we're still pursuing it. But in the process, we've also developed a lot of other ideas, and who's to know which one of these will be the one that takes off, right? But the bread and butter, the heart and soul of what has pushed me forward since grad school is electrochemistry, energy storage, and I'm still continuing to push on that one.
Yeah, so then that's good transition then to get into this project that we were going to talk about. So your Redox-Active Polymers for energy storage. Now, actually, I didn't know this because until in detail until this conversation right now, that you were kind of working on something similar while you were in graduate school. So this problem that you came up to while you were at CU Boulder of the precursors being cost prohibitive, that problem is now something you're trying to solve as in your faculty position in your lab right now at Mizzou. So yeah, take me through just a brief intro to this project. Then you've talked a bit about it earlier here, but yeah, give me a quick pitch on what's going on with this project.
Yeah, sure. So the fundamental goal or the fundamental driver for this direction of research is that we want to make better energy storage, better batteries. And why do we want better batteries? It comes down to sustainability. If we want to have independence from fossil fuels, if we want to use wind and solar to power electric vehicles and not need gasoline, we need better batteries, longer life, lower cost, higher performance. The fundamental idea that I think started many years ago when I was in graduate school, to conventional battery, you have like micron-sized particles of your reactive material. Because you have these large particles, the battery charges slower. And that's because the ions have to diffuse through the particles, and that diffusion is really slow. So solid state diffusion is a lot slower than liquid phase diffusion. So we had this idea of, rather than using large particles of this active material, if you could take that active material and spread it out in an ultra thin film on a high surface area conductive support, you then reduce the length scale for ion diffusion, and you allow the material to charge a lot faster. So nanoscale thin films, high surface area carbon, ALD is tailor-made for that, right? Mm-hmm. You use ALD surface reactions to grow up thin films on the carbon, and you get a uniform coating, same thickness everywhere on the carbon. and you should be able to charge it a lot faster. And when I was in graduate school, I worked quite a bit on manganese oxides, and you can grow manganese oxides in that way. And we showed that you can use it for energy storage. You get pretty good electrochemical capacities. We also showed that you can use it for water desalination. So you put that same thin film coating of manganese oxide on carbon, you apply a potential, so that manganese oxide absorbs positive ions, and you have to pair it with a separate material that absorbs negative ions. When you charge up both electrodes, you pull the ions out of water and you can desalinate water. Both of those applications, they work, and we demonstrated the kind of proof of concept. But again, the manganese oxide was the problem. The precursors you need to deposit manganese oxides or other redox-active elements, inorganic materials, are just really expensive. Like if you take a kilogram of high surface area carbon, it costs about $10 for a kilogram from a chemical supplier that I buy from. And if you bought it in bulk, it would be cheaper. But then if you look at the manganese precursor and you calculate how much of that precursor you need to put one ALD cycle on that carbon, it works out to $150 of precursor per gram of carbon for one ALD cycle. So that's like, you take that kilogram of carbon that costs $10, and now to do one ALD cycle on that kilogram, it's going to cost you $150,000. And that's just, yes, with cost curves, you might be able to get to a lower price point, but it's still really expensive. And so that's what we were up against in graduate school. Like the concept works, the materials work, but the precursors are just too expensive. And so that I spent some time trying to think about, and we did at the time when I was in graduate school, what other materials could we put down? And the ideas that we were having at the time, the thoughts that we had were focused on inorganics, right? That was just where I was at the time. And honestly, it took me some time to come back to this and realize it, but there are organic materials, polymers, that have those same properties, that when you apply a potential, they undergo a redox reaction and can store energy and absorb ions. So the same properties we wanted out of the inorganics. My second postdoc with Jeff Elam at Argonne National Lab, I could not have drawn the monomers that I'm working with now. So this paper that we just published was on polypyrrole. I could not have drawn a pyrrole monomer in graduate school. I didn't. If you had said draw pyrrole, I would not have been able to. It was just not the area I was working in. And since then, I've learned a lot. I've had to learn a lot to work in this area. But the reason I wanted to learn all of this stuff is because if we can take these monomers, they're petroleum byproducts, you could derive them from bioproducts. You take those monomers, and if you can then use them to perform surface reactions, self-limiting surface reactions, and grow up redox-active polymer films, they're now cost-effective. So these organic polymers, the organic materials, the polymer materials that we're working with, the reactive precursor, the pyrrole monomer, it costs on the order of, so that same comparison I made earlier, $150,000 of the manganese precursor to put down one ALD cycle. For pyrrole, it would be $100 of worth of the precursor to put down one ALD cycle, which is very much more on the price point level that you need to make it cost effective and actually do something, right? Actually make a product.
Okay, so now you've gone from inorganic to organic. So now you're, I presume, moving from ALD process to some kind of MLD process.
Right. Yep. That's exactly right.
So I've watched your talk from last year's ALD meeting. So it was one on capacitive desalination or deionization, CDI, right? And of course now your recent paper that was published this year on these, and I'm curious, what is the kind of the capacity difference now? So you're moving from something that is expensive to something that's not so expensive. Now, is there a trade-off based on the capacity that you can have? So, your manganese oxide thin film versus now these polymer thin films that you'd like to use.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good segue into the broader scope of the technology that we're working on. So this paper that just came out, we demonstrated oxidative molecular layer deposition, so oMLD. It's same MLD process that you might be used to seeing, but just one of the reactants is a gas phase oxidant. So it uses a monomer and an oxidant dosed in sequential exposures to grow up a polymer film. In that paper, we demonstrated polypyrrole and polyparaphenylene diamine. And then we also blended them together and showed that as you alloy, if you will, the different monomers into a copolymer, you see a difference in redox properties. And really that points to this ability to control the molecular structure and use that molecular structure to control to dictate the redox properties, which is really exciting. Like that level of control over polymer structure is not really accessible with other synthesis techniques. The conventional synthesis for polymers is a lot messier. You get kind of random formation of different oligomer structures, and then those quench together, and you have very little control over the long-range polymer structure. But with MLD, I mean, that's what ALD and MLD do, right? Sequential surface reactions, molecule by molecule controlling the polymer structure. We demonstrated you could synthesize those polymers, but the broader scope is that there are fundamental questions about why these polymers have the properties they do and how to make it so they have improved properties that really have been intractable or hard to address with conventional polymer synthesis. And because we're kind of figuring out how to use MLD to grow these polymers, it gives us the ability to control the structure and then ask questions we haven't been able to ask before and better understand the origins of the properties these polymers have, the molecular scale origins. So you asked about capacity. Let me answer that question directly. The theoretical capacity. So if you look at the polymers that we're growing and you imagine every monomer were redox active and you calculate a theoretical capacity, these polymers have higher theoretical capacities than some of the proposed next generation lithium-ion battery materials. So they theoretically could beat existing or known pathways for the next generation of lithium-ion batteries. Right now, the achievable capacity is like 50% or lower than the theoretical for these polymers. And there's not really a good explanation for why. You can come up with some reasons, but the different reasons that people have talked about in the literature haven't really been proven. And so it allows us to test that, to figure out what really the limitation is and why we have not been able to achieve the theoretical capacities, and maybe find a way to overcome it so we are achieving a higher capacity. This paper that we just published, the electrochemical capacity we got for polypyrrole was about double of what people have observed previously for this same material. And we think that's because we formed favorable molecular structures because we formed the polymer structures monomer by oMLD. We didn't have solution artifacts. We didn't have kind of side chains or defects because we did it through molecular layer deposition. The oxidant may have also played a role through the dry synthesis, but we achieved a higher capacity than had been reported before for that material. And it did fade though. So it was the first 30 cycles we had this really high capacity. And after you cycled it 50 times, it came back down closer to what people have observed before. So we now have this way of making these materials. We can measure what their properties are as we change the local polymer structure by using different monomers. And the vision is we'll be able to answer fundamental questions for what the limitations are that are preventing these materials from achieving their theoretical capacities, and then help them to achieve capacities that make them competitive with lithium-ion battery materials. Another one of the key advantages, you talked about capacitive deionization. Part of why we're interested in polymers specifically, you can put them in organic solvents that have high voltage windows and use them for batteries, but these polymers are also stable in water. And they've been used in aqueous sensors and other applications going back to like the 1990s, not grown by MLD, grown by more conventional polymer synthesis methods, but they're stable in water. And inorganic materials, especially redox-active ones, it's really hard to keep them stable in water. When you charge and discharge them, especially nanoscale film, those redox-active metal centers just want to change oxidation state and will dissolve and fall away. But the polymers, they're covalently bound networks of polymer, and the redox-active sites will react, but you're still keeping the covalent backbone of the polymer. So they're a lot more stable in water for that reason.
This is really exciting. So you have this very clear application of where these polymers can be used, but you have so many fundamental questions that can be asked about how you grow these films and what are the properties of these films, which I think is just exactly the story of ALD in general. It's just ALD was patented and then commercialized and made into this manufacturing technique. And even just I was explaining to a colleague the other day, we can figure out how to use ALD for an application probably pretty quickly, and we can say, yeah, it works for this thing and it does this thing we want to do. But all the questions of fundamentally what's happening at the surface or how the film is growing or how it's affecting the substrates or just in general ALD fundamentals, some of them maybe not even known. We just know that it works for the application. So in a way, we've kind of worked our way backwards with some of these processes. But yeah, so a big chunk of your paper then was about controlling this molecular structures. So kind of changing like the ratio of different monomers that you're using and so on. So could you walk through maybe a little bit of the findings from that work when you're changing the polypyrrole and the PPDA monomer ratios and what you found happened with the electrochemical properties as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So the polypyrrole was pretty straightforward. Prior to this work, others had generated studies and results showing that you could grow polyethylene dioxythiophene, so PDOT, by oMLD. And that, at the time we started on this, that was the extent of the work that had been published and using oxidative molecular layer deposition. All the studies when we started were on that PDOT chemistry. And so we had this idea, well, if this chemistry works, it should work with other monomers. And so we set out to try other monomers. The pyrrole went really smoothly, and it worked exactly the way that we expected it to. And it kind of reinforced this idea that, yeah, this chemistry works the way that it's been described. But then, interestingly, when we try to use aniline, so aniline is a little different molecular structure. It's not a 5-atom heterocycle. It's actually a benzene ring, 6 atoms, and then there's an amine group, primary amine group sticking off of it. So it looks a little different, but if the mechanism worked the way kind of we expected it to, it should have been able to grow. And we were able to grow films with the aniline monomer, but it had some weird behavior. We saw that it had kind of exponential growth with each monomer dose. The mass gains would double. So you could grow really thick films really quickly at lower temperatures, which that was just an anomaly. Why is this happening? It was confusing. So at elevated temperatures, that behavior went away, but we still didn't get redox activity the way we expected to. We didn't seem to be forming polyaniline, at least not long range order polyaniline that you form by chemical oxidation or electrode deposition of polyaniline. And it turns out, after some analysis, we realized that we were forming azo groups. And so an azo group is just the two nitrogens are double bonded together. So we formed azobenzene in part instead of polyaniline. And it turns out those azo groups are actually interesting. The azo groups are redox active at a very negative potential. So closer to the potential for an anode material in a lithium-ion battery. The polypyrrole, polyaniline, the other materials we were trying to grow are redox active at a positive potential, making them good as a cathode material. But these azo groups are redox active at a negative potential, so they could be used as an anode. When we realized that, we used polyparaphenylenediamine. So paraphenylenediamine is just 2 amines on a benzene ring, and they're opposite each other in the para position. And so if you form an azo group with two primary amines sticking together, and if you then make your reactive molecule have an amine on either side, you should form polyazobenzene, so a polymer that has lots of these azo groups in it. And when we demonstrated you could do that, turns out you get some what they call phenazine character. So that just means sometimes the monomers react head to head, and sometimes they're kind of crooked, where they react together without forming the azo group. We get a blend of the two structures. But we do have azo groups there, and those are redox active at a negative potential, and we show that that azo group is redox active that we formed. And then we had this idea that, well, if we want to have a cathode material, right, if we want to make it a positive electron, we don't want these azo groups, we should be able to disrupt the azo formation by reintroducing the pyrrole back into the polyparaphenylenediamine film. So dose that pyrrole kind of in an alternating exposure with the PDA monomer, and block the formation of azo groups. And it turns out that's true. We're able to, with enough pyrrole doses, prevent the formation of the azo groups and kind of reintroduce, kind of direct the polymer structure to be primarily phenazine character and have most of its redox activity at positive potentials. Yeah, that kind of comes back to that molecular structure control. By tuning the monomer ratios and how much monomers we dose in what order, we can control the molecular structure and therefore control the redox properties. There was some kind of interesting redox behavior too that we're still trying to understand exactly what was happening and what the potential applications could be, but we were able to control by having the right concentration of monomers and the right dosing orders. We could make it so that the parole monomer didn't react until after the phenazine reacted. So you kind of see in a cyclic voltammogram, so as you're applying a potential and measuring the current, you only see the parole reaction show up after the phenazine has reacted, that's interesting, and that's not something that I've seen reported before in the literature. It might have implications for nanoelectronics. When you have a material that has a property that you've not seen before, that's just there's always an opportunity to take advantage of it, and we're still thinking about how we could do that.
Oh, cool. So is there something that you're working on now that you're taking your knowledge from this newfound findings of that you can control the molecular structure? Is there some kind of new project that maybe you can or cannot talk about where you're using this this knowledge, or something that this is now how to apply this to something else that your lab has been working on?
Yeah, I can talk about two things. We have actually two NSF projects that are funded in this vein, using oMLD for technological applications. One of them is for desalination electrodes. So we're actually trying to make compressible sponge electrodes by starting with a polyurethane sponge and then infiltrating that sponge with an electrically conductive and redox-active coating. And so I talked about some of the materials just now, polyethylene dioxythiophene, polypyrrole, polyaniline. All of those are really on the table, but ultimately we need to impart the properties that we want. So high electrical conductivity and redox activity. So that is kind of a challenging project. The polyurethane, that's kind of a hot topic in ALD right now. If you take a chemistry and try to infiltrate that ALD chemistry into a polymer substrate, there are always kind of unexpected reactions that happen. You have to think about the precursor reaction with your substrate, precursor diffusion into that substrate. So there's some optimization for the synthesis, right? Doing the infiltration into the polymer support. And then separate from the synthesis, that we now, if we can get the properties we want, the goal of the project is to be able to compress the electrode. So in capacitive deionization, really it hasn't been able to achieve its potential for energy efficiency. If you look at it at a high level, capacitive deionization should have a similar energy efficiency, or theoretically better actually, than reverse osmosis. But all of the studies that have been done to date show that it has, a factor of 10 lower energy efficiency than reverse osmosis. And at a high level, there shouldn't be a reason for that. You're using an electrochemical process. It's microscopically reversible. You should be able to recover input energy and approach the thermodynamic limit for energy efficiency for water desalination. And so what we're trying to do is figure out why we can't achieve that. And this idea of using a compressible sponge electrode, what it allows us to do is independently control the redox capacity, so the thickness of the material and how much charge it can store, and the void volume in a dynamic way. So we can, by compressing the electrode, we can adjust the length scale for ion diffusion in the electrode in real time, and then see how that impacts the rate of uptake into the material. So basically trying to answer this fundamental question, what is it that's limiting the energy efficiency of capacitive deionization? And then the other project that we have funded using this sort of chemistry is actually for solid state batteries. The vision there is that these polymer coatings that we're developing, they have varying properties for their ability to insert anions and cations and electrons. So there you can kind of control the lithium ion conductivity, the anion conductivity, and the electron conductivity by changing the polymer structure. And so what we're trying to do in this, so this is this project I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that was just funded this summer. What we're trying to do is take cathode materials for lithium-ion batteries and solid electrolytes used in solid-state lithium-ion batteries, and use these MLD coatings to deposit onto the cathode surface and then study how those different coatings affect the reaction between the cathode and the solid electrolyte. Solid state batteries, the idea has been around for a long time, but it was only in the last decade or so that people discovered and developed solid electrolytes that are approaching the ionic conductivities of liquids, where they actually perform as well as a liquid. The problem is that those solid electrolytes react with the cathode material when you assemble it, really both electrodes, but we're focused on the cathode material. They react together and they form an interface layer that has low electronic conductivity and low lithium ion conductivity, and it really stops the cell from functioning. So even though separately the materials have the properties you want, when you put them together, they react with each other and you can no longer achieve the properties you need. And so by using these different coatings on the surface, we're trying to understand really what is the mechanism going on. Is it a chemical mechanism? Is it an electrochemical mechanism? How are those materials reacting together? If we can understand that, we can then propose solutions that fix the problem. And so we're using the ability to put down different polymers with different properties as a way of controlling what reactions we're allowing to happen between the two materials to then get insights into the fundamental mechanisms driving that degradation reaction.
It's interesting. So it's not necessarily a solution for the problem, but more a pathway to then eventually find it. So you're using this as a tool, essentially. Yep. Yeah. That's really cool. I think, I guess it's almost like using ALD or something to make a sensor, but I don't know. This seems like even a more like abstract method as like a diagnostic almost for these batteries.
Yeah, I guess really there's two projects I just talked about are doing a similar thing in that way. They're using the control that you get by ALD and oMLD to impart the properties, known properties, right? You're imparting known properties on a material and then observing what happens when you have the properties that you know you have to then understand something fundamental about electrochemistry. And the two applications are capacitive deionization, so understanding energetic limitations for electrochemical desalination, and then solid state batteries, understanding the interphase reactions between the cathode and the solid electrolyte. We kind of hope in both, like we kind of strategically designed these projects so that hopefully in the process of gaining the information about what the problems are, we will be able to solve the problems, but you never know when you start, right? And I think that as long as you design your project where the goal is the deeper fundamental understanding, then even if you don't fix the problem, you will have made an important contribution.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense to design a project in the hopes that, okay, if we figure this thing out, then also we can do the next step as well. It's a very self-sustaining type of logic to doing your grants and project design. This is a really small technical question that I'm just curious about, but what are like the thickness scales that you're working on? Of course, we're talking about thin films here, and the whole point was to make something on a small length scale to improve diffusion, but just maybe an ALD or MLD person is curious how much you actually have to do to get these properties and to gain this knowledge that you're now getting.
In this paper on polypyrrole and polyparaphenyldiamine, we show that we can infiltrate to aspect ratios of 200 to 1 and get uniform thicknesses. The material thicknesses that we actually studied electrochemically and the thickness range we were interested in was less than 100 nanometers. And on the order of 20 to 50 nanometers is perhaps the most interesting, so that we have that small length scale for rapid solid state diffusion. But still enough thickness that we have an appreciable electrochemical capacity.
Matthias, I have a question. It's maybe a philosophical question, but now that you are at Mizzou in your faculty position, you're working on some of the problems and gaining some of the knowledge that you maybe hoped that you would get while you were in graduate school. Is there some advice, something you would tell PhD student Matthias?
That's a really good question. That's a question every time I had an opportunity to talk to like CEOs or somebody in the companies where I interned, I would always try to ask them that question. I would say, I think the advice that I would give is the same advice that I got actually from my dad when I was deciding whether or not to take a job at a company out of undergrad or to go to graduate school. So a young Matthias or a young person that's similar to me in that same space, you're too young to give up on your dreams. So that's what my dad told me when I was deciding whether to go to grad school or go to industry. And so I would encourage anyone who's a junior, a student, a grad student, somebody thinking about going to graduate school, go for it. I think that there are lots of problems out there that you can't even begin to imagine. And it's not until you get into it and start to understand the landscape of what has been done, what hasn't been done, that you really appreciate all the things that could be done. I think especially in the ALD, MLD world, there's just so many opportunities there that I see. I don't have the time to pursue all of them, right? I kind of have to focus and decide what I'm most interested in and where my skill sets will be able to make the biggest difference. But there are so many opportunities, a lot of room to make a big impact.
That's good advice. I think, yeah, that advice is timeless. I think for anybody, you can be 70 years old and maybe you are still too young to give up on your dreams. But yeah, I think I don't know if I had the exact same sentiments when I was in graduate school of all the good ideas or something were gone, but I feel like I didn't have the same like perspective that I have now about what ALD can do and where it's going. Of course, you see, some of the things that are happening in the ALD conferences. You see some of the projects that are coming into your lab, but it's completely vast and there are new problems popping up every day for people to solve. And we need people to solve them. Is you have people like me who leave the lab and maybe are not solving those kinds of problems anymore. I did think maybe different problems, but do you feel like you missed out on anything during those couple of years that you weren't doing ALD? Do you feel like there is something you would have like now looking back you wish you had done instead?
No, I don't. I think that everyone has a journey. Sometimes you go down dead ends. I really don't think that that path at NIST was a dead end. I gained a lot of perspective and experience. I learned while I was there, I got connected up with Nick Bedford, and he was really my mentor who taught me how to do X-ray diffraction and pair distribution function analysis. So I went to did my first synchrotron trips with him, and that helped inform a lot of the work that I've done since. So we didn't talk about it today. We focused on the polymer deposition, but I've had 3 or 4 papers recently on using pair distribution function analysis to measure local atomic structure of films grown by ALD, and that technique I gained because of my postdoc at NIST, and it kind of changed my perspective on things, changed my thinking about what sort of questions need to be answered and what techniques we can use to address those questions. So I gained a lot from the experience. It wasn't wasted time, and I took a lot of value out of it.
Yeah, well, thanks, Matthias, for again taking the time today to chat with me and talk about your work and just let me learn a little bit more about you as a person and your journey with ALD. And I think hearing these types of stories are what is going to help other people, because for sure everyone's experience is unique, but no one's experience is, I think, isolated. So there's a lot to glean off this. So is there any place that we can follow you in your work? Do you have some social media, websites, things that we can come find you at?
Yes. My website is thinfilmgroup.missouri.edu, and I have a Twitter handle, twitter.com/Matthias J. Young.
Perfect.
So
That's
follow
easy.
me at Matthias J. Young. Yep.
And do you have postdoc PhD positions open in your group if there are people from Mizzou listening or people who are planning to apply to Mizzou soon?
Yes, definitely. We have. I need a PhD student for sure. We're always looking for good PhD students. PhD students graduate. We need to continuously recruit more. So if you're interested in a PhD position, please contact me. We are looking for a postdoc right now as well. If there's anybody interested in a postdoc position, I encourage them to reach out.
Well, great, Matthias. Thanks again for doing this. I hope that you found it fun, beneficial, and hopefully it was a nice chance for you to talk about your work a little bit. And I had a really great time, and I have my Colorado mug here for a couple of CU Boulder alumni.
Thank you so much, Tyler.
You're listening to ALD Stories with Benek. the home of ALD. To stay tuned for new episodes, make sure to follow us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Apple Podcasts. We hope you enjoyed today's show. Talk to you in the next one.